It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Hey, welcome, fellow Quillers, to this deep dive exploration into Julius Caesar and what some have called the greatest dramatized closing arguments ever presented to a jury. In this case, the Roman populace. Thank you for being here. So glad you could join me. Now, I know some of you are thinking, what about the closing argument Atticus Finch gives at the end of the courtroom scene in To Kill a Mockingbird? And you would be correct in assessing that that is up there among the top. Some of you may be thinking of your favorite episode of Perry Mason, or perhaps L.A. Law of the 1980s. Yes, I am that old. But you would be incorrect. I myself, little known fact, have delivered some decent closing arguments in my day. Yes, indeed it's true. In fact, I was awarded Prosecutor of the Year in the Riverside County, California mock trial competition my junior year in high school. All thanks to a lightning bolt closing argument that I delivered that was taught to me by my mock trial coaches, attorneys Paul Gretsch and John Reese. It was a case built on circumstantial evidence, including a series of events and occurrences that all coincidentally lined up against the defendant. Fictional case based on a real, it was like one of those things where the names have been changed to protect the innocent, or in this case, to protect the guilty. Paul and John taught me to take the circumstances and compare each of them to an occurrence as rare as a lightning strike. Each time one of these details pointed to the defendant, I said it was like he was struck by lightning. By the end of the closing arguments, the defendant had been figuratively struck by lightning more than 10 times. My final statement to the jury, which was composed of 3 sitting Riverside County Superior Court judges at the time, my final statement to the jury was that either the defendant was a walking and talking human lightning rod, or he was guilty as charged. And the jury, these 3 judges, found the defendant guilty, and I was awarded Best Prosecutor of the Year that year. I think there were some 10 or a dozen schools that competed at that time. So I felt very proud of receiving that award. There were at least 2 prosecuting attorneys for each team, so I was the top out of around 24 students. I sometimes still use that lightning strike analogy when speaking about the evidence against Edward de Vere as the man behind the invention of Shakespeare. With so many biographical aspects of the works attributable to Edward, either the writer was joined with Edward at the hip through most of his life and therefore able to draw upon the details of Edward's life to include in the works, or he was there every time Edward was struck by lightning. Or was it Edward himself pouring his own personal experiences into the plays and poetry? One specific area I and many others have focused on when it comes to tying Edward de Vere to the works of Shakespeare is, of course, the legal knowledge found within the plays. And I believe the monumental Shakespeare event we hosted at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis last April presented enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the author of the plays was not only a lawyer, but the best legal mind of all time. Now, I know you're thinking, why do we need such a sensational term? The GOAT of lawyers? Who is he? Tom Brady? Michael Jordan? Why the need for the greatest of all time title? And to that I say, we have no problem giving that title to Shakespeare as a writer, greatest of all time. So if we can demonstrate that one of the reasons he was the greatest of all time, the GOAT of all writers, is because of his mastery of areas of knowledge such as the law, then why shy away from naming him the greatest legal mind of all time? Okay, fine. Let's make it a question. Was Shakespeare the greatest legal mind of all time? When we do that, we have no choice but to ponder the qualifications that could determine someone guilty of the charge of that prestigious title. Most of you listening out there are well aware of the 1987 mock trial presented before 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices that accused William Shakespeare of Stratford of the crime, I'm using air quotes there, of being William Shakespeare of renowned authorship fame. Justices William J. Brennan Jr., Harry A. Blackmun, and John Paul Stevens were presided. They presided. You can still find a video of that event, by the way, on C-SPAN, and I will place a link on our Patreon page to go with this episode so that you can find it. And by the way, I know I sometimes promise to provide links to things on our social media pages, and then I forget to do that. So if there's anything I ever mention and fail to provide, just send me an email reminder to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, and I'll make sure to put those links up that I always promised, or pictures or images or whatever supporting information that I sometimes mention on an episode and then forget to make a note to myself to follow through. So if I've done that, I apologize. Just send me a note to remind me, hey, Stephen, you promised that link. You promised that picture. So in 1987, 3 Supreme Court justices presided over a mock trial case. Coincidentally, the exact same 3-judge system of the official high school mock trial system used across America. And coincidentally, the very same year I first served on my school's mock trial team. Interesting. But I digress. Back to the 1987 trial. Unfortunately, the justices were not presented with arguments that the writer known as Shakespeare was a lawyer. I believe that would have changed things considerably. They were instead presented with a case that accused Shakespeare of Stratford of being a writer. And on that charge, the justices were divided. It is interesting that in the case, Chief Justice Brennan begins by explaining the appellate nature of the court's convening. Part of that is legal stuff because 3 Supreme Court justices gathered together in one place to hear a case, even though there isn't actually a real case. They just were covering some bases there. But he mentions Oxford and Edward de Vere first. And then he explains that the burden of proof is on the Oxfordian position, even though it's Shakespeare who is being accused of being a writer. And the evidence to be presented is to be presented to prove him guilty of being a writer. So it's kind of a weird situation that I think explains that the justices themselves were a little uncomfortable with the nature of the proceeding. Anyway, he says that the Oxfordian position is the position that bears the burden of proof. And he explains that he would be seeking to rule on the preponderance of the evidence. But we are asking something different. We're asking, was the writer known as Shakespeare the greatest legal mind of all time? And if he is not worthy of that title, is he at least worthy of acknowledgement as a highly trained lawyer? In short, did this author know and disseminate to others through his works the origins of what has now become our modern legal system? Is there evidence of his mastery of the ancient origins of Greek rhetoric, schemata, and philosophy, then continuing into Roman law born out of oration and later codified by the great Emperor Augustus? Was he versed in the ecclesiastical system of law born out of Catholicism and the laws of the church? The answer is yes. That's at least 5 lightning strikes right there. The entire canon of works demonstrates a legal mind who was well aware of the detailed rules, statutory bodies, and mechanisms of the legal system dating back to its basic origins. Hammurabi's Code, the 10 Commandments, Christ's Beatitudes, the Magna Carta, and very complex and ever-changing system of laws of the 16th and early 17th century. But he was also aware of the importance of case law, precedents, legal debate, and the power of the convincing closing argument. The works of Shakespeare helped to shape and move the judicial system in a positive way forward toward personal liberty and rational justice. The quality of mercy is not strained, but faults so countenanced that the strong statutes stand like the forfeits in a barber's shop. Discuss unto me, art thou officer, or art thou base, common, and popular? In law, what plea so tainted and corrupt, but being seasoned with a gracious voice, obscures the show of evil? The law hath not been dead, though it hath slept. And this one, which is self-deprecating, yet wise in its knowledge. I have, perhaps, some shallow spirit of judgment, but in these nice sharp quillets of the law, good faith, I am no wiser than a daw. I could go on and on. But each of these quotes, and at least 50 others, have been cited in major U.S. court cases over the decades as arguments made by modern lawyers to strengthen their cases. Look that up if you don't believe me. No other writer holds a greater title in U.S. law history. None, not even close. But there are more than 50 major U.S. court cases where lawyers chose to quote the works of Shakespeare. Many of these cases changed the law, becoming what is known as stare decisis, or simply put, case law, upon which future cases were decided based on precedents set by these earlier cases, and in many ways, centuries after they were presented as arguments by one character to another in a play. They helped to further sway society away from dictatorial rule towards the rights of the individual, human justice, personal property, and a countless list of others that you might say led to securing things such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for future generations. But let's say that instead of holding a mock trial pitting one defendant against another or a prosecutor against an advocate, we were instead to stage a different form of legal adversarial contest, sort of a lawyer Olympics, so to speak. I once served as a judge at a country fair that conducted an annual farmer's daughter competition. Young ladies competed in a series of contests based on country living. The premier event was the tractor race through a series of obstacles and challenges. It was quite something watching these young ladies control that equipment in and around obstacles, through puddles of water, through muddy terrain, lifting boulders and moving them to the right location. I mean, it was amazing. They were fantastic, all of them. If we held a lawyer Olympics, though, then I would say, based on my own personal experience as a competitor in such a challenge, the literature of both the ancient and modern world, and the courtrooms of history and the present day, I would say oral advocacy would be the premier event. I get it. I know it's not tractor races, but I believe oral advocacy would be the premier event in the Lawyer Olympics. The winner of the competition would need to present a lightning bolt closing argument before the jury in order to claim the top title. And if we were going to select an entry for the writer known as Shakespeare, we could have many to choose from. There are several good choices from scenes in Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well, Timon of Athens, of course, The Merchant of Venice, Hamlet, Again, the list goes on and on. But if I were Shakespeare's mock trial coach, I would encourage him to present Julius Caesar. The play is chock full of exceptional oral arguments. Cassius makes more than one awesome appeal to Brutus, to the collective conspirators, and to Casca, using every aspect of rhetoric and schemata to convince his selected juries of sorts to follow his plan. Brutus makes several great oral arguments, including a soliloquy he uses to convince himself as his own jury to take action. And of course, his brilliant piece of oration in Caesar's funeral scene. But it is Mark Antony who delivers the bard's best closing arguments to a jury in all of literature through the guise of his eulogy of Caesar, presenting his summation of evidence against Brutus and the honorable men who slew his ambitious friend, convincing them of heinous murder in the eyes of a jury of the people. Perhaps the largest jury ever assembled to hear a case against multiple defendants. Antony uses all of the skill of a great prosecutor to know and work the emotional side of his jury, and not only bring them to a unanimous decision, but to strong and immediate action and the carrying out of severe sentences for the crime they have committed. Many scholars believe Julius Caesar represents the grand Shakespearean concept for the law. Some see Mark Antony as a man seeking vengeance, but legal minds see him as a man seeking justice. There are no petty suits or property battles in this play. There are no contracts per se to be argued. There are touches of inheritance and probate, even adoption, as Caesar adopts Octavius to be his son. But the main framework here is actually constitutionalism based on classical republicanism. Now, of course, not republicanism with a capital R, as we see it in America today. But let's not forget that the founders of American constitutionalism based the U.S. form of government on the Roman Republic. In fact, it always drives me batty when people refer to the United States as a democracy. P.S. It is not a democracy. It is a democratic republic. Indeed, it is a republic. It is not set in ancient Athenian law, the inventors of democracy, but rather ancient Roman law. And there is a very big historical difference. Though both are constantly threatened by descent into oligarchy and the pseudo-aristocracy of elitism, they are still very different. This is something a nobleman lawyer with one of the oldest titles in all of England clearly would have understood. But not unlike today's modern governments on both sides of the Atlantic, what we see in Julius Caesar is classical republicanism at work in a society heinously split by factions consumed with obtaining or maintaining power by any means necessary. Propaganda, coercion, fear-mongering, crowd-baiting, deceit, distortion of the facts, and near outright mind control of the multitudinous mob. I love that word, multitudinous. P.S. Shakespeare invented it. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar is a study of both the ends and definitely the means in the law, and illustrates, as I have just pointed out, how the law and politics are forever intertwined, with one often using the other wielded like a bloody dagger of execution. But what we see most in Julius Caesar, after we look past one of the bloodiest death scenes in history, and also thus dramatic literature, are lessons in the law founded in the importance of oral advocacy. Think about the advocacy Matthias Cimber presents before Caesar in argument for the lifting of the banishment of his brother-in-law, and Caesar's famous response, "I am as fixed as the North Star." I must prevent thee, Cimber, he says. In other words, your words cannot move me or the law. Your advocacy is ineffective here. This is a brilliant juxtaposition right before Caesar's assassination, with Casca's words in delivering the first wound, "Speak, hands for me!" Ugh. And he stabs Caesar in the neck. Brutus's defense of the conspirators' actions before the crowds of Rome, and ultimately Antony's exceptionally effective arguments to turn the tables on them all, are other examples of oral advocacy in this play. In each of these examples, any lawyer can find lessons in both poor and successful advocacy. It's almost like a jurisprudence doctoral thesis, with Antony's speech serving as the capstone. Of course, it doesn't hurt that Antony has some of the best props in closing argument history. The bloody garments Caesar was wearing when he received his 3 and 30 wounds. P.S. a slight embellishment of 10 additional wounds from what Plutarch actually describes, but we know that our writer Shakespeare loves the number 3. Caesar's bloody, lifeless corpse. And of course, the coup de grace, Caesar's last will and testament, benefiting the multitudes of Rome. It's a courtroom trifecta that any prosecutor would love to have in their fingertips before a jury. Blood evidence, including blood-stained garments, images of the bloody body of the victim, and documents to support the case. Slam dunk. Any lawyer throughout history would see these aspects of the funeral oration scene as a study in lawcraft, especially when comparing the rhetorical styles of the two orators. And anyone can see how and why Antony is far more successful at convincing the jury that the defendants are guilty. At the same time, our author is comparing ancient Rome to Elizabethan England. He makes this play turn upon oratory because of the importance of oratory to the Republic of Rome. Our author clearly understands this and is steeped in the history behind it. The politics of Republican Rome and the very development of the legal profession created a wide demand for public speaking in the forum and in the courts, in the Senate and at lavish dinner parties even. Roman orators commanded attention and distinguished themselves in Roman society through their skills. Great schools of rhetoric grew and prospered in Rome. Books were written about the rhetoric, rules of composition, prose rhythm, and of course, that all-important style of delivery. In fact, how many of you sat through, watched, or listened to a lecture or presentation that was full of fantastic research and astounding details, but bored you to tears because of the style of delivery, because the orator was monotone or boring or spoke like this? It happens in every field of study. In fact, it happens especially in the field of Shakespeare authorship quite too often. But I digress. Not everyone can be a Brutus or an Antony. Some are better at one-on-one manipulation, like a Cassius. Others let their hands and actions speak for them, like a Casca. Some fumble and bumble, like Matthias Cimber. Others fall to flattery, like Trebonius. Definitely not my style, as anyone who knows me can tell. One very interesting aspect of Shakespeare's play, however, is his nod to 2 of the greatest Roman orators of all time. The great Julius himself. Let's remember that he started as a priest and minor politician before becoming a great general and then returning to politics. And the great Cicero, who the bard gives only a minor role to in the play, but uses as a keen example not to be dismissed in the play as one of its profound messages. Brutus says of him, "He will never follow what other men begin." How astute. How many of us know hard-headed, stubborn old men just like that? Nonetheless, Shakespeare obviously knew that Cicero was one of Rome's great orators. Hundreds of Cicero's writings have been preserved and are still studied by scholars to this day, including some of his poetry. Yeah, a little known fact, Cicero actually was a poet, and we have some of his poems. They're not that great, but we do have his poetry. Caesar himself once wrote to Cicero, obviously before the famous assassination. He said, "You have discovered the treasures of oratory. You have gained a triumph to be preferred to the greatest generals." And Caesar knew what he was talking about. So did our writer, who may have even been versed in Cicero's writings. Of course, he would have had to have read them in Latin because they weren't translated into English until long after Shakespeare was dead. However, in the case of the murder of Julius Caesar, Cicero may have been complicit, and he also ended up paying the price for it, but he wasn't an active conspirator. So it is Brutus who must deliver the argument for the defense, and Antony who prosecutes the case. And a look into the work of scholars such as Daniel Kornstein and Justice Richard Posner helps us understand just how important these two arguments are from a legal standpoint. Brutus speaks first, and rather briefly. His speech is scarcely longer than his soliloquy earlier in the play, where he convinces himself to do the deed. And whereas that soliloquy is in verse, speaking to himself, his speech to the crowd is in prose, almost as if he's talking down to them. Perhaps he believes they are not worthy or capable of understanding his best eloquence. His appeal is to the crowd's sense of abstract values. He attempts to shroud his conduct in his popular name and well-known personal virtue. As Cassius makes clear to him more than once in the play, and as Brutus himself states in his soliloquy, it was his ancestor who drove the Tarquin king out of Rome to help establish the Republic. He almost demands the crowd believe him for his honor. And then he reminds them of how much he loved Caesar. Indeed, history tells us that it was an open rumor that Caesar was actually Brutus's father, because Caesar and Brutus's mother had a widely known love affair. It was a sort of non-versation going on throughout internal circles of Rome. Perhaps Brutus acts as he does in order to put those rumors to rest. See? I'm a true Brutus of the line of my forefathers, not a bastard of Caesar. Would I slay my own father? No, but I would slay my best friend out of duty to Rome. In essence, he tells the crowd if they should ask why Brutus rose against Caesar, this is my answer. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. He attempts to explain his meaning in terms of political abstractions. Had you rather Caesar were living and die all slaves than Caesar were dead to live all free men? Essentially, Brutus makes use of his skill for rhetorical flourish to justify Caesar's murder as having been necessary to block Caesar's ambition to preserve freedom and a place in the Commonwealth for each citizen. Brutus tells the crowd that he and his conspirators slew Caesar for the good of Rome. Essentially, I did what I had to do for the sake of all of you. His relatively concise speech appears to succeed with the jury. It is carefully constructed and it builds on rhetorical devices such as repetition and antithesis. Caesar less, Rome more. Caesar bad, Republic good. Ugh. He both undervalues and underestimates the Roman public. But they do appear to buy into his rhetoric, hook, line, and sinker. Caesar was a threat to the Republic, and therefore he needed to die. The crowd cheers Brutus, and they even exclaim, "Let him be Caesar!" You saved us from the threat to the Republic. Now we want you to be the supreme leader. And it is that very exclamation that shows us something has gone very wrong with Brutus's speech long before Antony ever opens his mouth. The crowd, in wanting Brutus to be the next ruler, their savior of the Republic, obviously missed the point. Perhaps Brutus was correct about the ignorance of the plebiscites. Brutus's speech, though basic in construction, is still elaborate in its rhetorical structure, that the hearers know they are listening to a formal utterance which sort of distances them from the speaker. Brutus's formal style, his repetitive circling, and his reliance on abstraction is dry and bloodless, devoid of any passion. Perhaps the people of Rome have too often heard empty words about preserving the good of Rome as a mask for greed and power of the elite class. And they're tired of it. Now, whereas Brutus speaks briefly, Antony speaks at length, often working around and even incorporating interruptions from the crowd into his speech. And he speaks in verse. Brutus was cool and abstract. Antony is hot and concrete, using vivid and vital expressions interwoven with clever wit and strategic innuendo. Though Brutus was successful and effective, Antony is far more successful because he accomplishes his goals in the face of a jury already leaning toward the defense. Antony begins with subtle and clever indirection, not misdirection. He knows exactly what he is doing, but definitely using a sort of Socratic method of leading his audience to the truth he wants to share. He says, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. Though, of course, he means just the opposite. He begs the crowd not to allow him to stir them up, when, of course, that is exactly what he wants to do. Antony refers to noble Brutus, and in an oft-repeated and increasingly sardonic refrain, he continuously refers to the conspirators as honorable men, using all 4 syllables of the word each time in order to provide clear emphasis to his edge of sarcasm. A brilliant aspect of Shakespeare's writing here, using the meter to require all 4 beats of both that word and also the word ambitious when referring to Brutus's description of Caesar. Antony's ironic repetition of Brutus is an honorable man was actually used as a reference point in a 1978 court case, Lakeside versus Oregon, here where I live, wherein the Supreme Court upheld a conviction after the trial judge, over the defendant's objection, repeatedly instructed the jury not to draw an adverse inference from the defendant exercising his constitutional right to not testify. Judge, to the jury in that case, you must not consider the defendant's choice to exercise his Fifth Amendment right as any inference of his guilt. You must not do that. It is his right to refuse to testify on his own behalf, and you must not make any inference about that choice. You must not do that. He made a lawful choice here, and you must not consider that choice in your findings on this case by any means. You must not do that. Just as John Paul Stevens cited Antony's funeral speech and pondered whether the court could find petitioner's argument as strange if the prosecutor or even the judge had given these instructions 3 or 4 times in slightly different form, just to make sure the jury knew that his silence, like killing Caesar, was consistent with honor. Boom. Now, we know Stevens was a Shakespeare authorship skeptic, and cases such as these only serve to prove that his skepticism was obviously based in his love for the works, and his knowledge of the works was obviously profound. In his speech, Antony also makes clever use of self-deprecation, even belittling his own skills of oration. In this way, he follows Brutus's lead in using his own reputation with the crowd to serve his purpose. They know him. They know him to be a successful general and leader of soldiers, a lover of revelry and pageantry. And he tells them plainly, I am no orator as Brutus is. And then goes on to display oratory skills well beyond his opposing counsel. It's an old trial lawyer trick as old as ancient Rome at least. And it's been made famous times over by the I'm just a simple country lawyer technique in this modern era. And lawyers have for centuries now used the Antony tactic of deliberately assuming the role of the underdog. Just an honest plodding bumpkin who happens to have a law degree, representing a poor client who only hope is a jury who believes in true justice in the face of this unfair and unequal representation. The honorable men who slew Caesar have the noble Brutus to represent them. Poor Caesar only has me, a barbaric type who is more comfortable on a battlefield than in the forum. And then Antony proves that he can bring his battlefield strategies to play with the crowd. Unlike Brutus, Antony takes his time to build a suspenseful climax. He begins slowly, attempting to lead the crowd little by little, gradually charming them over to his side and tempting them with lures like hungry fish. First, he refuses to read Caesar's will, and his initial restraint converts easily to fervid eloquence when his harnessed passion finally overflows. Like any good lawyer should do, he continues to gauge the level of emotion in his jury and the level of emotion they are capable of. And then he continues to lead them to greater levels of that emotion step by step. As mentioned before, he makes great use of demonstrative evidence at exactly the right moments to elicit maximum emotional impact. The bloody garment, Caesar's will, and Caesar's lifeless corpse. Imagine a prosecutor today holding up a bill of sale for the weapon, then the blood-stained knife, and finally photos of the carnage suffered by the murder victim, and saying, if you have tears, prepare to shed them now. Antony literally cries tears over grief, over Caesar's body. I don't recommend that trial lawyers use that tactic. But seldom would they have any personal connection to the victim the way Antony does. And he also uses his well-known relationship with Caesar to great effect. In the modern courtroom, it might be references to the victim's family sitting in the gallery. Here, it is Antony himself who now becomes the sympathetic mourner as he whips up the crowd's emotions to a near fever pitch. At this point, he is strategically using emotion to destroy reason while he continues to make his case for a guilty verdict. And all the while, he continues to deny any inflammatory intent. Now he knows he has the jury exactly where he wants them. Brutus has already left the forum and thus relinquished any opportunity for rebuttal. The frenzied mob not only finds the conspirators guilty, but they are intent on meting out immediate justice through a sentence of death. Now let it work. Mischief, thou art afoot. Take thou what course thou wilt. As Justice Posner declared, the funeral orations in Julius Caesar are an extraordinary example of how Shakespeare changed the law and the legal profession forever. recommending that litigators should ponder these two oral arguments before summing up to any jury of their own. Brutus's speeches, defined as this: conspicuously rhetorical, which puts the audience on guard. It fails to engage the audience with any dialogue-like aspects. It is abstract and lacks detail. It fails to appeal to the concrete self-interest of the audience. It fails to present critical evidence to support the crucial charge of Caesar's ambition. And finally, Brutus makes the terrible mistake of waiving his right to rebuttal by leaving the forum before Antony speaks. Antony, in contrast, avoids all of these weaknesses and adds a number of his own strengths to his argument. He offhandedly and without pomp tries to diffuse what is immediately to him a hostile audience. That whole beginning of the speech, "Friends, Romans, countrymen," is meant to be Antony fighting against the crowd to get their attention. The crowd is stirred up. Brutus should be Caesar. Brutus, we love Brutus. And Antony comes along there. We don't want to hear from Antony. And he says, friends, blah, 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 blah. Romans, blah, 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 blah. Countrymen, lend me your ears. And they finally calm down and they listen. I do not come to praise Caesar, but to bury him. And they mellow out some more and they listen. It's brilliant. He then promptly deals with Brutus's charge of ambition. They have told you that Caesar was ambitious, and they are all honorable men. Then, unlike Brutus, he uses emotion to sway the jury. Forgive me, for my heart lies there with Caesar. He uses props, physical evidence, and visual aids. We covered that. He tells an anecdote. You all did see him on the Lupercal, where I did thrice offer him a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this in Caesar ambitious? He tells another anecdote. You all do know this mantle, for you did see it when Caesar wore it after he was victorious over the Nervi. And after this foundation, he then proceeds in dramatic fashion. Then, in addition, he has minimized his own oratorical ability, successfully disarming the audience. He uses the terms of a legal document, Caesar's will, to appeal to the jury's concrete interests and their sense of gratitude. He invites frequent interruption to create the impression of conversation between he and the jury instead of a lecturing monologue. And instead of remaining in an orator's position, he moves about the platform like an actor. Posner isn't the only legal scholar who believes a good courtroom lawyer would do well to follow this example. As he says, be concrete, vivid, personal, conversational, versatile, dramatic, and empathetic with your audience. In comparing our two Roman lawyers, we find that Brutus was successful in winning respect and agreement. But Antony won the day with passion and the incitement of action. So if we indeed were to conduct a lawyer Olympics, and we chose Julius Caesar as Shakespeare's entry into the oral advocacy event, I think that we find that he continues to hold the world record. A world record set back in the 16th century, based on an incident that occurred 33 BC. Yeah, that's an intense thing, isn't it? And let's say we were to forward up some other contenders, some great lawyers in history. And I'll use U.S. lawyers because I know them best. Let's start with Thomas Jefferson, founder of the new republic in Roman fashion. Lover of Shakespeare. Abraham Lincoln, absolute lover of Shakespeare, who often used Antony's self-deprecating style of, I'm just a self-trained Illinois country bumpkin lawyer. Thurgood Marshall, who graduated from Lincoln University. Clarence Darrow, who followed Antony's tactic of gradual passion in many of his famous cases. Oliver Wendell Holmes, soldier turned lawyer. And many, many others who have found the works of Shakespeare inspirational and educational to their careers in law. There is no doubt in my mind that the author of the works of Shakespeare was a highly trained and skilled doctor of the law. And I'll leave you all with this quote from the bard himself. Who finds the heifer dead and bleeding flesh and sees fast by a butcher with an axe, but will suspect 'twas he that made the slaughter? Who finds the partridge in the puttock's nest and may imagine how the bird was dead, although the kite soar with unbloodied beak? Even so suspicious is this tragedy. And I say, even so suspicious is this tragedy that there are people in the world who still believe that the country bumpkin from Stratford was not only the greatest writer of all time, but the greatest legal mind of all time. Because the evidence is clear. This man was one of the greatest lawyers to ever live. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, Quiller Nation. And remember, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.